Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the podcast that works hard towards Ascension so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam Simpson. I'm joined by Terry Robinson today, and we are going to be giving you another episode of Tomes of Magic. Today, we are going to discuss the Orphan Survival Guide. Today,
I am doing fine. I don't know if I've mentioned it on the show before, but I'm doing a project with fellow host Josh Heath. It started out as a character sheet that we're like, hey, there aren't a lot of characters that you can just pick up and use as a player in Mage, and it was going to be based on our Norse Magick episode. And I start doing this right up, and Josh is helping and adding bits, and Josh is like, oh, isn't it cool? Wouldn't it be cool if we added this? And I'm like, oh, wouldn't it be cool to add this? Our character sheet is up to 12,000 words. So I don't know at what point it's a Paradigm book that has a character sheet attached to it, but by the time this episode is out, Paradigm Pamphlet Norse Magick should be out. That is not necessarily our final title, but I just wanted to share that the most Mage thing I have done recently is come up with a 12,000 word character sheet.
So sometimes the tail does wag the dog, but that can be a good thing.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, well, to kick off our episode today, the Orphan Survival Guide came out in 1998. Is the last Mage book to come out in 1998. It has a 23 on the spine. We have 5 authors for this book, including Justin R. Akili, who is well known for his many contributions to the Vampire the Masquerade line. And this book clocks in at about 132 pages and talks all about orphans, that is, mages who awakened on their own and stayed on their own. They're not joiners. They never joined a mage faction. Whatever instruction in the sphere of magic that they practiced, they either picked up on their own or cobbled together from bits they found from other groups. So to get a good handle on this book, I think it's high time for a Terry walkthrough.
We get a bit of introductory fiction by Rochelle Udall, and it is weird to open a book that has a bit of introductory fiction and not see the name Amanda Jensen anywhere. So that is the long-running meta plot going throughout second edition of the Euthanatoi trying to hunt down Vormos, Grand Harvester of Souls, possibly, and this is something completely different. We open to a tableau of a person sitting in a cafe waiting for people to come to her, telling the story of how this person came to where they were. And this becomes a theme that runs through it. It is evocative, it is short, and I have little else to say about it. The next chapter after the prelude is the introduction. And this just gives a quick overview of what this book is going to be about. And it also introduces an interesting aside method. It talks about what awakening is like for an orphan, what the first hardscrabble months are going to be like after that, and it introduces the idea that one of the recurring characters that will be likely in an orphan chronicle is the city in which the game is operating. It gives a quick overview of what people think of orphans. It makes a point of not capitalizing the word orphan. One of the recurring motifs in this book is terms like Ascension War and traditions are all lowercase and are all put in quotation marks to kind of be dismissive. And the last part of the introduction is a quick note that anytime there's information specifically intended to clarify something for a storyteller, it will often be done in the style of a tarot card that takes up most or all of a page. It is slightly tilted, and that is kind of the way that this book says, hey, this section is specific information for the storyteller. Did you have any thoughts about the introduction?
Yeah, the intro kind of sets the mood for the book right off the bat and has a couple of statements that were kind of strange to me. First off, it says that the word orphan in magical societies is a pejorative. It's like an insult. Wait a minute. Okay, this is new material that you're adding. It was never like this before. And why does this have to be an insult? It just says you're on your own, and they say themselves that they're on their own. I just don't see why this has to become an insult now. It says they aren't all goths. It's like, well, yeah, okay, we always knew they weren't all goths. We had books before that told us that. But also, if you're going to say don't stereotype them, don't paint them all with the same brush, then why is it that this book works so hard to say, well, if they aren't all goths, they are all inner city rebels who hate the world and are angry about everything. It's like, okay, if you're not going to stereotype them, then don't stereotype them, please.
Yeah, it's the stereotype they make is it zooms out slightly wider, but it's like, not all orphans are goth, but they are located in cities with greasy spoon diners that have to deal with chronic drug abuse problems. Although I would be endlessly fascinated if they had put out like the rest of the orphans, where it's like country orphan, suburban orphan, like, do you know which fork to use for cheese? The deadly Ascension War that happens in America's upper middle class suburbs. And the thing that got me about the orphan comment is, give me another word then. Like, if you're going to say this is an insult, be like, no, call us this. Okay, we'll call you that. They refer to the Hollow Ones as Darklings, which to me is no different than referring to a member of the Celestial Chorus as a chorister. Like, the two are kind of interchangeable. Just give me another word, and I don't recall them doing that.
Yeah, not really.
And I can certainly understand the, hey, the traditions call us this. We don't like the traditions, so by extension, it must be a bad word. Sure, fine. If they want to run around with a chip on their shoulder, that's something they're particularly good at. It helps them justify high strength and stamina during character creation.
Yeah, I noticed that. It's like, oh, you're going to call us that? Well, then we hate that. Just to show you that we're defiant of you on every level. It's like they weren't rebellious because of injustice. They were rebellious because that's what they do.
I'm fine with that, if that's how they're going to run, because I think it's an interesting little bit to be like, hey, I found this orphan, and the orphan goes, hey, don't call us orphans. Well, what should we call you? Not orphans. Okay, got it. And then we roll into chapter 1, which gives us a bunch of information about how urban life operates. This feels like a more practical addendum to Destiny's Price. It isn't quite as gritty, but it does give you some pretty good reminders that the order of importance for what you do as someone who is on their own in a city who may not necessarily have a stable place is to remember some basic rules. And I thought these rules were very good. The first one they list is know when to fight. I put this down as no matter who you are, in Mage, you probably only have 7 health levels, and a gun can do 8 health levels of damage. Avoid getting into scrapes if you can. It talks about your senses being your best weapon. The idea that one of the key things a mage has is the ability to pick up things outside of what normal people can perceive, and that little bit of extra information can keep you ahead of everyone else. There's a note that food is important, and it goes on a long walkthrough of places to get that. One of the things I did find interesting was that they kind of poo-pooed dumpster diving, but I went through a protracted period in the late 90s, early 2000s, where I'm not going to say I did competitive dumpster diving, but it was something that I found once I realized that dumpster diving was a thing, I started doing it with my friends somewhat aggressively. And if you know what you're doing, you can get a surprising amount of stuff out of suburban dumpsters and eat surprisingly well. Again, it was good that I did it in my late teens and early 20s. If you've never done it before, I strongly recommend everyone give dumpster diving a try. Dumpster diving is not formally endorsed by Mage the Podcast. Please don't hold us liable. It talks about ways to get places to sleep. And this is one of those interesting things that very much to me has changed over time, just because of changes in how urban planning has occurred and what cities do to kind of actively prevent people from sleeping rough. It gives you some items that should be in your bare bones survival pack. One of the things it includes is cigarettes to trade. Alcohol has a number of uses also as a tradable thing. The importance of a knife and plastic bags, how to get to know your neighborhood, and the importance of respect. There are 2 ways to have people respect you. One is to be helpful. One is kind of a more fear-based approach. And each one of those is perfectly acceptable. And then what I think the most important section of the book, or one of the most useful sections of the book, comes up, where it talks about what are the 4 stages of awakening for an orphan. And the way the book breaks this down is it refers to the burn, which is the initial freak out after you awaken, and nothing makes sense and you're seeing things you can't normally see. You have the focus, where you try and start piecing together a new life with these powers. The next is stacking the deck, where you start taking advantage of magic to make things go your way. And then the final chapter, the version of urban mastery, as it were, is the dawn. This is the point where you realize you have the powers, you've built up your web of connections, and you have the ability to control the world around you and possibly help other people. It gives a few bits of advice on how to deal with that, and then it goes into a whole bunch of lessons. I really liked the 4-part breakdown of how awakening worked in a city as an orphan. What were your thoughts, Adam?
The thing that got me was a lot of chapter 1 was talking about how hard it is to survive, how hard it is to get by. And I noticed that in the 4 stages of awakening, third stage is stacking the deck in your favor. I don't think the first 2 stages usually take all that long before they get to stage 3. And once you're stacking things in your favor, things are not so desperate, and you're not dumpster diving unless you have decided you choose to. So it's so hard to survive. It's so hard to get by. It's like when you can use sphere magic, it doesn't take that long to get to stage 3 where you're stacking the deck in your favor. And then are you really all that desperate? I mean, with low levels of mind magic, low levels of correspondence and time and other things as well, you're not going to be that hard up for that long.
The impression I got is there is kind of this internal tension in the book between things are hard all the time and also magic is amazing and can make things easier. So if things are still hard for you, there needs to be a reason. I don't know if they imagined that Paradox would be worse maybe in a city, or you would have to be exceptionally subtle for no one to notice you when there are a lot of people around. But it's one of those cases where, like, the 2nd edition Paradox rules were pretty generous. You had to do a lot of magic that was very obvious before it would really stack up, or you would need to have a punitive storyteller before it would come crush down on you. So that just felt like a case where the system and the setting weren't quite on the same page, because, like, the moment you get matter 2, you can literally turn lead into gold.
Yeah, I mean, they do, in chapter 1 and in the book in general, they do mention paradox and how it's a problem. And yeah, certainly it is. But yeah, nowhere in the book did they give advice to storytellers and say, hey, more paradox in the city, which I can kind of get behind that. That kind of makes sense to me. But it was interesting that the Stuart Wick view of Mage had awakening as something more of an intellectual experience. But here in this book, it really emphasizes awakening as an emotional experience. It comes on by strong emotions or by danger or trauma. So that was interesting for me to note as I was working through. I found the me first survival view so strongly pushed by chapter 1 as perhaps it's understandable, but kind of depressing. It's like if I'm going to play a character in an ongoing chronicle, if it's me first survival so much of the time, then that might be a downer for me. But also, I saw a surprisingly negative view of the traditions, the Council of Nine Mystic Traditions in this chapter. And I think this may be the starting point in the published Mage books of viewing the Council mages as less heroic and more power-grabbing, more self-serving. I think if I remember correctly, we see a lot more of that in Revised Edition. In first and a little bit less in second edition, the Council of Nine were basically, they were good guys and they were trying to do good things. Yes, they had their problems. Yes, they sometimes did selfish things, but basically they were portrayed, to the readers of the books as heroic and people that you ought to get behind because they're going to bring about a good result.
The chapter ends with a section of lessons, which are all kind of stories that the characters narrating the book have seen witness to. And one of the recurring ones is the story of a character by the name of Winter, who was a member of the Euthanatoi that kind of realized what the group was doing, didn't like it, and then ultimately decided to leave. So one of the cases where I feel like the book left money on the table was it is listed as the Orphan Survival Guide, but they also bring up a class of mages called errants, who are people who have left the traditions. I would love a book, not a long one necessarily, but just people who've left the traditions, why, how they feel about it, some of the dirt maybe they have, those that are being pursued by the tradition, those who aren't, and how they reintegrate back into the mage world.
This book would have been a great place to have a chapter for that. And yeah. I agree, that would be very interesting. That would be some material that I would like to read.
Another interesting breakdown they do is Justin Achille, who is a person who publishes a lot of World of Darkness theory, for lack of a better term, on Twitter. And one of Justin's key comments is, in almost every World of Darkness game, the players are fundamentally special because they are people of a supernatural bend that cooperate. So vampires are antisocial kind of by default, and their need to socialize with one another comes from the desire to see people of your kind. So the ability to have 4 vampires at a table or 5 vampires at a table that all get along is something special in the World of Darkness. And I kind of take that into Mage too, where generally you will have cabals, but they're maybe more at each other's throats or more self-serving than they are in the rest of Mage. Another tension that I had with this book is this would be awesome material for a one-on-one game. The moment there are 4 players at a table, I really would have liked more information on how to deal with that. Like, how do you keep 4 people up against the wall for like under pressure, and also prevent the accumulation of resources, and also prevent them from like quickly shuffling through this thing without just constantly dumping on them. I feel like this book was very much geared towards like a one-on-one game or individual characters. The final useful thing I thought was in this chapter was it broke down all relationships that a mage could have on the street as into kind of 5 categories. One is family, the people who will kill for you and the people you will kill for. Friends, they're the people you hang out with. Contacts, people that you trade something with. Allies, people that owe something to you. And beholders, people you owe something to. And I thought that was an interesting frame through which to look at the backgrounds that Mage uses.
I especially key in on that idea of the player character group making the player character special. I've said in a past episode that the player characters in a game of Mage are probably unique because we see in a number of published books that most mage cabals are sort of informal small societies where they get together and have coffee every once in a while or whatever it is they drink. And they trade notes sometimes. But the player characters are different because they actually travel together and they fight together. And they are much more unified and directed than most mage cabals that I've seen in the published World of Darkness. And so, yeah, that does make player characters special.
And then we start with Chapter 2, which is the second time that we have talked about a book that has a chapter on the Hollow Ones. And this chapter is pretty similar to what we discussed in Outcasts, The Player's Guide to Pariah, which was a World of Darkness publication. They trace the history of the Hollowers to the Romantic period, so the late 19th century. It lists the technocracy as having been formed in the mid-1800s or reorganized then, but we know it's the 1890s, but that's just me being a dork. And they talk about 2 people, Gladys Littleton and Gardner Morris, forming this thing called the Unseen Society. And they talk about this group of romantics getting together, thinking that Crowley is kind of a weirdo, and these other high-class people just doing magic for funsies is not quite getting it, is not understanding the emotion about it. There's infighting, there's backstabbing, some people die, but that is one of the places to which the modern incarnation of the Hollow Ones is traced. I argue that the first Hollower was the first teenager that was helping to build the Great Pyramids and just goes, "This sucks!" and just storms off into the desert. That person did not last long. First Hollow One, though, because every group in Mage gets to trace its existence back at least to ancient Egypt. And they talk about the influence of the British rise in occultism, the rise of German paganism, but the 2 big pushes after the Romantic period were, one, during the era of decadence after World War I. You have the Roaring '20s. You have wealth that is being accumulated and not really having the moral center of knowing what to do with it, and people trying to find understanding in emotion, and the Hollowers focusing on maybe the darker ones, anger, rage, sadness, and then a second wave occurring after World War II, that after so much destruction had been wrought and after so many human institutions seemingly were unable to prevent an absolute atrocity, that people tried to look for other fonts of meaning, and the Hollowers were there to catch people. One of the interesting things that is presented in this book is, this might be me reading into things, but the Hollowers are kind of presented as a neutral party between like the traditions and vampires, where their view of both seems to be about the same. They're like, we deal with both of them, and both of them we have our issues with, but we're fine if they want to hang around and they don't break any of our dishes or something like that. We get information on how status in the Hollow Ones work, what introduction, what joining a Hollow clique looks like, the fact that there will be a test of loyalty, that you will need to do an act of great worth or great strife, that you need to be cool, and so on. And I thought that was interesting. And there is one of the aside cards that is super important, and it says, "Where are the Black Hollow Ones?" And it is important to address that pretty well throughout Mage so far, the Hollowers are represented as being a bunch of white people, and being a bunch of white people in the United States and maybe Britain. And it talks about, hey, if the Hollowers want to be more global, or if you want to have non-white Hollowers, here are some of the groups to pull from. Talks about the influence of the Veves, the true children of the New Way, the LA-based Freedom Posse, Chicago's Candymen, the Painted Face Tribe, and just that paragraph or set of paragraphs talking about, hey, it doesn't just have to be white people, I think is super important to be like, hey, yeah, mage groups are large, they're global, some more than others. Here's how you can draw from others. We get an idea of what their punishments and what their crimes are, like the things that you don't want to do as a Hollower. Don't dose your friends with drugs, don't compel sex from people, don't snitch, don't kill your own unless you have a good reason. We get some information on how they interpret the spheres. And then again, we get kind of some wind down stories talking about some of the experiences that Hollowers in this book have had. It's a fine summary of the Hollow Ones, this plus the large list of rotes in the back and some of the information throughout this book. If you don't want to pick up Outcast Player's Guide to Pariah and you just have this book, I think this will get you 85% of the way there. But on the whole, I think it's a fine chapter on the Hollowers.
In some respects, it's has some improvements over the Outcasts chapter on the Hollow Ones. For example, I think it did a much better job of giving gathering places of the Hollow Ones. It says these cities, these clubs, and like this. And Outcast made a point of saying that even though the leadership of the Hollow Ones and the leadership of the Council of Nine has disagreements, and there's some negative vibes between them, on the street level, the person-to-person level, Hollow Ones and Council Mages can cooperate, they work together, and Hollow Ones don't lose face among their fellows for spending time with Council Mages. And so I thought that was kind of nice. I mean, it's like, hey, if you have a group of player characters and one wants to play a Hollow One, just put them in the group and it's okay. You don't have to make a big deal out of it. And now this book, Orphan Survival Guide, on its Hollow Ones chapter, it takes a stronger view against Council Mages. It says that, no, we don't like them, we don't hang out with them. If they show up at our gatherings every once in a while, we may not kick them out, but we're not so friendly with them. And so that was a difference. It was interesting that this chapter in Orphan Survival Guide talks about the high rate of marauderdom among Hollow Ones. That was not something mentioned in Outcast, and so I thought, oh, well, that's interesting to know, both as a Mage fan discussing it with other Mage fans and also as player characters in that setting. One thing that I couldn't really ignore just on a personal level is throughout this chapter they're always talking about how life is so hard and we're trying to survive. We're just trying to get by and not be stamped out by all these forces opposed against us. But at the same time, they're also always talking about how they're taking their pleasures. They have a rich social life. They're always going out to parties. And it's like, well, are they really that desperate? I mean, they keep telling me they're really desperate. Are they really that desperate? I wonder.
Yeah, there seems to be a bit of a scale issue. One of my key thoughts about this book is it fits comfortably within the Mage world, and it doesn't really disagree that much, but the author, like the in-world people, just have a different set of life experiences. So it's one of those things where, like, we know from Horizon Stronghold of Hope that the Hollowers petitioned for membership in the Council of the Nine. So obviously, at some point, there was a good-sized group there. There is a Hollower contingent that goes to Horizon. There is a formal ambassador that goes there. So, like, the relationship between the two can only be so bad. But the characters in this book have had bad experiences with the traditions. And again, I would have loved to have more information on the things that the traditions do, that the Hollowers and that the Orphans find so repulsive beyond just rebellion. Like, they give a good walkthrough for the Euthanatoi, like, have you met these guys? Do you know what they're doing? And you think that's fine? And I would have loved that for other traditions as well. Someone getting bored out of the Akashics, or not being able to deal with their discipline, or finding the Verbena to be too bloody, or not liking the way the Hermetics do things, and so on.
Yeah, at several points in this book, they make a point of saying, oh, they're all fighting the Ascension War, and that's what you might call a hot war. That means an active war with, like, bullets and explosions. And they're just going to recruit you and send out to die in an actual physical conflict. And so you don't want to be used as someone else's soldier, so stay away from the Council Mages. And at first I was thinking, as a Mage fan, my first reaction was, oh, no, you don't understand the Ascension War. It's happening on so many other levels. And in fact, there's less than half of the people in the Ascension War who are actively dedicated to it are actually, punching, slicing, and shooting. But then I thought, well, on the other hand, the Orphans don't know a lot about the Ascension War. They don't know a lot about what the Council and the Technocracy are doing. And so, yeah, there's going to be a lot of stuff that they just don't know. And so it's natural that they would hear the words Ascension War. Oh, I know what wars are like. I've watched the TV news. That's everybody shooting and bombs going off. It must be like that. And so, yeah, it's natural that they would have that misapprehension.
And there's also an idea that is laid down very heavily in 1E, and I think they lighten up on it a little bit in 2E, that a city is where the technocracy reigns, that the traditions have the wild places and the interstitial ones and maybe the abandoned ones. So if your exposure to the Ascension War is a Spectre limousine with black hats in it coming to try and mow down a traditionalist operating in the city, and that is your first view of the Ascension War, I think you're going to view it as a hot war. They're not necessarily seeing it on the cerebral level where there is a Verbena Chantry that is trying to coax a mythic thread back into existence or something like that, and they're not off in Horizon where their works are being defended and you have the time and luxury of planning. Yeah,
and we can get a glimpse of why in second edition they wanted to relax the grip of the technocracy on the average city so that you can have orphan communities like this and they don't get all stamped out immediately.
Yeah.
So, okay, I can see that.
So the next chapter we have is Chapter 3, Crash Space. And this gives you a sample, I'm going to say chantry, for lack of a better term, meeting place. It is not explicitly stated that there is a node here, but there's obviously some sort of dark energy. And this is called the Chapel Perilous. And it is a old blackened church that has had the windows blackened out and it's been repainted. And it hosts a rotating group of people there. And this I actually thought was a pretty neat idea, because one of the hard parts you have is if you want a character to be in touch with a bunch of groups, normally you have to have the character go to those groups. But Chapel Perilous on one night is Wednesday is drag night, Thursday is themes, maybe sometimes it is a music band or death metal, Friday is goth night. And so instead of your characters having to go out to all these different communities are coming to your characters. And I kind of like that as an idea, that you can have a stationary base of operation and different people going out. And then it reminds you that it's a World of Darkness game, where below Chapel Perilous, there is a kind of a set of flophouse rooms that people are down there, and if they can't pay, they are kind of forced to sell themselves or to do services for the chapel. And then yet below that, there's a dark hole that if bad things happen, a body can just be dumped down there. And the fact that they list the playroom as having a chute, that was a bit much for me. That's the part where I'm like, the chute that goes into the ominous hole where things don't return from, that was, I'm like, how about that? It goes over the regulars. And one of the interesting things it does here is not only does it give you a bunch of characters, but it gives you kind of the characters' agendas and how they interface with other characters there. Like, we get a lot of books that have a chantry or a construct. And generally people in those are largely getting along, which is why they're in a chantry or a construct together. But here it talks about, oh, this person really wants to play up this aspect of what the club does. This person seems to have complete control over who can get in and who can't. This person, though, is the one that actually pays the bills and at the end of the day should theoretically be right because it's their property, but this other person seems to have a social chokehold on the place. And as a storyteller, that is stuff I'm not very good at. I'm not very good at coming up with like those intermeshed, disagreeing agendas. So I appreciated that. It goes over a few other locations. The generic Majestic Cafe, where this takes place. The Heights, which is a penthouse in New York. A few other projects. We get much more information on the way down, the moving hollower chantry or party venue. And more importantly, to prove that this is a second edition Mage book about a city, we get a questionably rendered BDSM scene with people in leather, this time moderately priced zippers, and we get boobies on page 68. So if you needed to check that off your list, it's there. But on the whole, it's perfectly fine characters. I kind of wish they had full stat blocks. Instead, it just gives you a rete and spheres and maybe key attributes like, oh, this person has a high appearance or what have you, or a high strength or something like that. I kind of would have liked full stat blocks, but I can see what they're doing.
Let's see. Well, Chapter 3 was mainly Chapel Perilous. I thought it was interesting that on the back of the book for Orphan Survival Guide, it says, hey, we're going to give you a nightclub that you can drop into your own Mage Chronicles. Like, oh, yeah, like Destiny Price. Sounds familiar. But I will say, in defense of this one, it is better than the one we get in Destiny's Price. The one in Destiny's Price is less detailed. And as a reader, I got the impression that, okay, this is the place where the characters will go once, get some information, maybe have a bar fight, and then they leave and they do other things. Chapel Perilous is more, there's more there. And so I picture this as a place where the characters are going to go. They're going to find out, oh, there's a lot going on here. We better come back again to, get this or learn about this person or accomplish this goal. And so, yeah, this feels more like a place where the characters are going to visit multiple times. Also, it was an interesting example of how the Hollow Ones, they're not all-powerful, they're not all-knowing. In the Outcast book, you get this impression from the Hollow Ones chapter that they are really powerful, they are really knowledgeable. If you mess with them, they'll see it right away, and they'll stomp on it. And it's like, these people are so competent that why aren't they accomplishing more in the world of darkness, for one thing? But here in Orphan Survival Guide, we get the Chapel Perilous, where there are two cliques or two groups of Hollow Ones and other orphans mixed in who gather, and these two cliques oppose each other. They don't like each other, and there are a lot of really bad things happening at the Chapel Perilous, and the Hollow Ones don't really know about it. So the Hollow Ones are not all-knowing and all-competent in every part of the map. There sure are a lot of powerful NPCs in here, though. Yeah. When you look at the few stats that they do have for the NPCs, these are really powerful types. I think most beginning level characters would show up here and feel like, wow, these guys can step on us if we're not careful. And so as a storyteller, I might tone down some of these NPCs. This is intended to be story ideas. This is a place where young, poor sleepers are enticed to come in, find a cheap place to stay in the basement. Then they run out of money, they're desperate, and they're encouraged to take drugs. They're twisted by the Banes. They are pushed into becoming prostitutes for the rich people that come, I think it's Monday night. And then a lot of them die because the rich people are violent and very rough, and it like gives a percentage of how many of them die being prostitutes. And then they're shoved down the chute. They go down to the lower basement, and the bodies disappear forever. And this awful situation can continue. And so this is a situation where the weaker cabal of orphans and Hollow Ones has a clue that something's wrong here, and they'd like to maybe try and end it if they can, unless they're mistaken. And then you have the stronger clique that is saying, no, we're comfortable here, we're happy here, this is going to continue, we're going to put down anyone who tries to break up our party, is basically their party line on that. And so, this encourages the storyteller to build stories around it if you want to use this setting in its entirety.
The next chapter is Chapter 4, The Chosen Few, and this is your character templates and your notable characters. The character templates are fine. Again, this is one of those cases where it presents a character that is struggling to raise a family, and it is interesting that this person is having difficulty with things when at the same time you have Entropy 1 and Mind 3 that feels like it should solve some problems. But again, hey, that's everyone's going to roll it differently. The next section are the noted shadows, which are important characters or ones of importance. And we get more information on Jody Blake, the recurring Nefandus, who has been causing issues apparently in non-specific ways throughout second edition, and then comes back in the book Ascension to rule over Babylon. We get the character of Baron, who I thought was interesting because this is a character who writes books about awakened society, but sells them as kind of paperback potboilers, which is the second time this happens. And Baron is in the rarefied company of Doc Eon, who writes about the mechanocracy, which I think is my favorite fake name in all of Mage.
Yes.
We get information about Penny Dreadful, character that gets a series of novels. We get more information on Neville Sinclair, bringing the total number of write-ups about Neville Sinclair up to, I think, 16. We get information about Jennifer Rollins, who is a character who is depicted often in the art, but is not very much fleshed out in the plot. Pops up a bunch of times, is in the Mage 20 Art of Mage book, and a few other characters, and then the section winds down. My favorite was Baron. Justin Achille has a fondness for including self-referential stuff. I think Justin Achille is behind the World of Shadows, which is the Black Dog Game Factory version of the World of Darkness, and you have Warlock the Pretension and Revenant the Ghouling, or whatever it is, or Pixie the Dementation, or whatever it is. So I liked the Nine Twisted Tales that Baron writes. Did you have a favorite character or a thought on any of the templates that we get?
Well, Chapter 4 gave us a lot of repeat signature characters from the Outcasts book. In fact, most of the characters we get in Chapter 4 we read about in Outcasts, and a couple from Hidden Lore, the Overflow book of Second Edition Core book. They try to make up for that by saying, well, here's where they are now. And it's like, well, okay, I suppose that's kind of interesting. It was interesting to see how Sasha Winters is a Hollow One, and she is giving us a hint of upcoming metaplot for Mage. She's saying, hey, I'm really into death and what lies beyond the shroud and plumbing the depths of the lower Umbra, and something big is coming. It's going to change everything. And yeah, that something big does come. There's a maelstrom in the lower Umbra. It tears up the place. We get the Avatar Storm of Revised Edition. And so this is their hint of the coming metaplot, and it's right here for us.
Chapter 5 is our, for lack of a better term, I'm going to say storyteller chapter, where it tries to say what is actually going on here. And this is a lot of advice and a lot of information on how to do this. And one of the things I thought was interesting in this chapter, it talks about how one way to run the street level game is where street level is a phase, where yes, Adam and I have talked at length about how a mage character who has access to the spheres is likely not going to stay on the streets for long without really good reason. And it talks about, yeah, this could just be a phase in a chronicle before the characters decide to join a tradition or move to a different place that's safer or spend time across the horizon. And the idea that this street level Orphan campaign is just a phase in a longer game, I thought made vastly more sense than how this has been traditionally presented. And that some characters, like the ones here, have chosen to stay a more or less orphan life, either because they had difficulty with the traditions, or they had something that was keeping them in the city, like family, or they had some problem that was preventing them from otherwise setting up a more stable life. Some people just like it. They prefer the sense of freedom and the sense of timelessness. George Orwell in Down and Out in Paris and London talks about the utter freedom that he had when he was homeless, that the notion of time was unimportant. As long as you were fed and dry, everything else just kind of floated away, assuming that you thought you had a reliable way to get food and shelter and safety. It walks through the different themes of the game, and the discussion of the difference between Gothic and punk, I thought was something that should have been in the core book. Mage bills itself as a game, as a Gothic punk game, as does the World of Darkness. And these I thought were pretty good discussions on what these ideas are. So you have the Gothic sensibility that everything is larger than life, that passion, sex, death, and sanity take on godlike forms and mythic overtones and are these huge things, and the world is dripping with symbolism. And I really think that would have helped to have been in the core book, or at least re-emphasized. And this is one of the few books that goes back to, hey, this is what this game thinks this game is about. You can deviate from that, but this is what the writers have in mind. And I think that is helpful and clarifying.
Whereas I have a very controversial disagreement, Terry. I totally disagree. I think it should not have been in the core book. It should have been in the Book of Mirrors, the Storyteller's Guide.
I can take that, yeah. Or at least reiterate it, certainly. And then it talks about like the key ideas of punk, the ideas of rebellion born of disgust, a hatred of normalcy, a dislike of materialism, a looking down upon the status quo. And there are fewer, better ways to throw off what you consider to be the strictures of society than to eschew wealth and traditional symbols and to decide to live on a day-to-day basis. So it provides a, for lack of a better term, a philosophical basis for someone being an orphan and choosing to remain in that style of life. It also goes over a bunch of notes on tropes to avoid. There's a specific part where it's like, don't have katana wielding trenchcoat ninjas. And it also talks about how only vice cops, professionals, and dorks wear trench coats. And I'm like, hey buddy, I'm a dork and I don't own a trench coat. I think that satirist Phil Mercado at one point posted a picture of the White Wolf staff in the 90s, and literally all of them are wearing trench coats. It's a group of like 12 people, and they're all in trench coats. I'm pretty sure it was self-aware, like they knew they were all going. This was like trench coat day in the office, in the same way there might be like wacky t-shirt day. The fact that they all had the trench coat is kind of the indicator to me. And then finally we get a bunch of story ideas. What could have a character being in the city? And you get the idea that the character is part of a touring band or part of the road crew that you're dealing with, or alternatively, you're going undercover to deal with kidnapping and body snatching, which is a plot thread that I have used before. A character is trying to deal with an addiction of some sort. And another one that I've also used is the characters are kind of caught between a war between two other supernaturals, that you could have a were-creature vampire problem or ghosts against tradition mages, and the characters in some way are kind of caught in the middle. Was there any storytelling advice here that resonated with you?
I did enjoy the Gothic punk specification. When I first came to that, I thought, oh no, they're going to tell me again. I know this stuff. And I kind of did. I kind of have a rough understanding of Gothic, and I kind of have a rough understanding of punk and how they're different from each other, but they can go together. But reading this section, it refined a lot of things for me. It was actually helpful for, okay, now I do understand Gothic a little bit better than I did before. And for the punk section, I liked how they were very frank. They said, look, this is what punk is about, but it's very hard, it's very harsh, it wears you out. It is not like the recipe for having a happy life. I like that frank discussion of punk. I like the fact that you didn't try to present it as the end-all be-all that's just the coolest, and if you're not with it, you're not cool. Like, I noticed in here that the writers of this book really like to focus on character-focused stories for Mage. They really like the idea of, hey, an NPC who's close to you goes through this very hard time, and it pulls the player group into this kind of a situation. And that helped me understand better some of the parts of this book that were a little harder for me or a little less appealing to me. I guess who I am, I prefer more plot or concept-focused stories. And so that helped me take a milder approach to this book, where otherwise I might have been a little harsher. It's like, look, these are people who want the character drama. The interpersonal relationship-based stories is what really gets them fired up. And so they bring that to their writing. And that's why, this book was a little different from what I might consider my ideal book. I ran a chronicle a while back that was based in Chicago, and I had my player characters visit the mean streets, but they didn't live there. And I thought it was very fun. There were a couple of sessions where I really brought in that mean street flavor, and I thought it was very entertaining for the players and meaningful for the ongoing story. But I didn't dwell on it too much, and my player characters certainly weren't a part of that scene. They felt like aliens or visitors there, and I think that heightened a lot of the drama in a number of the scenes and made it very interesting. At first I kind of reacted against that one-page sidebar on you should be more realistic, you should not have so many trench coats and swords and stuff like that. And I noticed that they did not make the distinction between a duster jacket and a trench coat jacket. See, in my closet, I have an actual trench coat. I do not have a duster jacket. In the 90s, duster jackets were really the big thing. They were even showing up in a lot of big budget movies. I noticed that this is counterbalanced because the very next book that comes out for Mage is Dark Magick, Tales of Adventure, Dark Magick. And it like totally flips to the other side, where it's like, let's get out the trench coats and the swords and the car chases and the explosions, and we are going to have an action movie based instead of realistic based Mage Chronicle. And so it's like that helped me kind of take this sidebar its proper balance. It's like, yeah, this is the book where we emphasize plausible, realistic, gritty, day-to-day life kind of stuff. And the next book is where we have high adventure and high-budget action sequences. So it's like, oh, okay, I'm not going to get upset telling me how to run my chronicle because this book is telling me how to run a certain kind of chronicle.
Likewise, it would be like complaining that Horizon Stronghold of Hope wasn't gritty enough and that this book doesn't include enough 5-dot forces effects for my taste. You're like, I don't think you're quite following what this thing is going for. I do like the idea, though, that Trenchcoat Katana should, rather than just being the archetype, should be part of a family of archetypes, and that we should have, like, Wakizashi Cape, or we should have...
the Tonto Plancho.
Exactly. To quote Shakespeare, this shit writes itself. I think if Mage the Ascension puts out an April 1st supplement, it may be alternatives to the Trenchcoat Katana combo. Or I think my favorite would be, have you ever seen those hats that like have umbrellas baked into them? That and like a claymore. I think that fits a certain sensibility. This chapter also includes one of my favorite lines of, it doesn't take Chris Carter to come up with plots for an anarchist mage. And part of me is like, good. He had no idea what he was doing. Ooh! For listeners at home, as opposed to our video listeners, of which there are none because we're a strictly audio podcast, Adam held up a cutting item of some sort who I will allow Adam to define it because I have no idea how to identify swords and sword-like implements.
This is an actual Tonto and not a replica Tonto. It's one of the real deals. So I just thought that was, I wasn't thinking of it when I mentioned Tonto a minute ago, but then as Terry started talking, I was like, wait, I actually have a Tonto.
I literally have one of these.
This is the Tonto. So yes, Tontos are real, and I do not take this outside of my home or let my children anywhere near it.
And it is also one of the only reasons that we've been able to produce an episode every week at this point for 2 years. Other people have been gunning for us, but every time ninjas attempt to take Adam down, they have been caught unaware by his wielding. I have a set of intricate traps in my home that protects me. You have been warned, rest of the podcasting world. And with that, the appendix. The appendix is just like every other appendix. It covers rotes. It covers interpretation of magic. It gives some character ideas. It talks about how to create a character, and it goes into detail in saying, hey, these are backgrounds that you should probably include, and these are backgrounds you should probably not include. Like in a city, you likely have many dots in allies, avatar, destiny, dream, but most are not going to have chantry node or library or resources without a good reason for it. And I like this. And one of the things we brought up previously about how to do a street level campaign without punishing characters in XP terms is to hand out backgrounds as a resource. It's perfectly reasonable that over the course of a game, you will pick up dots in allies, or maybe improve your relationship with your avatar as you're facing down death and destruction or what have you. And as a storyteller, I think that's perfectly fine. It talks about a bunch of magical styles. So it gives you something in between a character concept and what would be a paradigm and practice in M20 terms, where it talks about black magic or the brujeria, the backroom technology and weird cybernetic implants and designer drugs that are available in World of Darkness cities. The idea that you are a pagan of some sort, or focus on self-help magic, or lean into Victorian occultism or voodoo practices are all perfectly fine. And then we get a whole bunch of rotes. And some of these are interesting, and this show is sometimes marked as clean and sometimes marked as explicit, so I will stick with this episode so far largely being clean. The fact that we get the rote pairing of F off and die in terms of rotes that just kind of cause people to die at a distance. I'm like, well, that's a little bit on the nose, and I feel like that doesn't necessarily fit into a gritty urban chronicle, but hey, it's there. Rat Storm, which is a rote where in an area you will just summon a lot of vermin, I thought was kind of cool. I don't know if I necessarily agree with the spheres that they choose. Second edition didn't make any sense sphere-wise, which is entirely fine. And we get a bunch of rotes, and unlike previous books where it's like, this is a gritty starting level game and you're an orphan who has no one to teach it, thus this thing requires 4 4-dot spheres. This toned that down a bit. There's not a huge number of rotes here that had 3 or more dots. And then the book closes out with some sources and a big old character sheet. Did you have a favorite rote? It was an impressively long character sheet. I mean, it was a standard 4-pager, but yeah.
I will say, that was quite a character sheet, especially for an orphan. But yeah, page 114, they give the storyteller the suggestion of have your players roll up their characters initially as 6-4-3 on the attributes instead of 7-5-3, I believe it is. And so that's basically lower powered. And it says don't give them any mystic backgrounds or sphere dots or arete, and have them play mortals. And then once they awaken, which you can make a part of your table experience, then you can quickly hand out the points that would bring them up to starting level mage character. That's a viable option. I have nothing against it. However, I would like to recommend that if you are running a gritty street level chronicle, I think it's better to take the character template that starts out with Apprentices of the Art, which is just 1 or 2, or maybe 3 or 4 books away here. And that is a lower powered character. It's still a mage, still has arete and sphere dots, but less of them, less attributes, less skill dots. I think that lower power level will pair nicely with the street level chronicle. It mentions one of the styles of street magic as being the self-help witch, and this is a term in the book. This is someone who takes the modern paperbacks sold in many light, fluffy occult shops, and it takes rough, obvious ideas from many different cultures and religions and mythologies and puts them all into one book as a sort of messy mix. Sells well to 14-year-olds, but people who are more well-versed in magic and the occult tend to frown on these books. But it says that a lot of orphans in Mage Chronicle are not going to know the difference, and they'll pick up these books and they'll base their magic on it, and because they are awakened individuals, they can do sphere magic on it. And I thought, yeah, okay, it's appropriate for this idea to be here. However, as a storyteller, I would say that you can encourage your player characters to take up the self-help witch magical style. But I, as a storyteller, would add difficulties and make it harder to do once they try to use this magical style with sphere level 3 or higher, because I would want to emphasize to my players, hey, this is a rough, messy smattering of ideas. It got you started. You can run with this. However, it's harder to run farther with it because it is a pretty messy mix of ideas. There isn't much internal consistency. And I would even emphasize it at certain points to the character during the game. It's like, yeah, you kind of see how this doesn't hold together very well, and you're kind of doubting it yourself, and that's why you're getting these higher difficulties. So now that you're up to Arete 3, 4, and you're using higher level spheres, it's time to transition to something different. And I think this is appropriate for an Orphan campaign. It's like, look, you got you this far, you notice a limitation, now it's time to grow as a mage.
There is an interesting segment in one of the opening chapters of the book where it talks about one of the characters saying, I learned more magic in those 5 days than I did in my entire time with whatever group they had come from, which brings up an interesting question. Adam and I have had the discussion before of should tradition mages who have access to libraries and things have an easier go of magic or not? And this book very much kind of gives all sides of that, where it says on one hand, orphans don't have access to all of these other resources. On another hand, they are not beholden to a tradition. If a hermetic student has to spend a bunch of time studying, but they also have to spend a bunch of time cleaning out the chantry and attending to higher mages, maybe those two things balance out. Or maybe orphans have access to truer knowledge because when you're under the gun, you learn better, or at least that's one of the hypotheses. And I am still not sure how I feel about that. That is a question that kind of followed me through this book. Does it make sense to have it more one way or more another? And I comfortably come down on all sides of that issue. But I do like Adam's idea that there are certain paradigms that at low levels are very easy to do, and at higher levels may be more difficult and may require some sort of introspection or some shift to maintain the ease at which magic is done. And that is a super neat system that I would love to see at some point.
Yeah, Terry and I have had a number of discussions on this, and yeah, a lot of interesting points come up. There are different ways to view this and different emphases placed on this concept between early first edition and later second edition. On that note, there is something in the fiction towards the beginning of the book, I think it's chapter 1, where an orphan is talking to another and says, I have this friend who's an orphan mage, and she awakened when her house was on fire, and to this day, she's really good with fire magic. So I was thinking, this book would have been a good place to have some section in the appendix where you say, look, here is how an orphan can specialize in this area of one sphere, but do poorer in the rest of it. Like in forces, you can do really well with fire magic, but if you're trying to deal with light or sound, etc., you're going to be not as good. It would have been nice to have just some sidebar or a paragraph or something, a page that says, look, orphans kind of get a little bent in their teaching. They sometimes they get really good at this, but not as good as the other thing, and that's different from tradition mages and more established faction mages. And because of that hint in chapter 1, I was actually expecting to see this in the appendix. And when it comes to the rotes, I like the fact that there is no rote in this book that uses a sphere higher than level 3. If this book talks so much about how orphans are in the dark, they don't know much about what's going on in the world of darkness, they're scared and trying to get by day to day on the mean streets, yeah, give them some low-level rotes to work with. And I got to say, one rote I thought was genius, backdoor parole, which, of course, is old prison slang. It's a cynical way of talking about someone who dies and they pull him out of prison. It's like, well, he got out of prison, however, he had to die to do it. But backdoor parole is a way to cause your body to die and fake death. And if you use it at the lowest level, you can basically, lay still and people will examine the body and say this one's dead, but then you can, bounce back later. At the higher level, which I thought was what really interested me, is you can get up and walk around, see and hear and interact and continue to exist, but your body is physically dead. What is the use for this? You can hang out with vampires and they think you're a vampire. And I thought, oh, yes, this is genius. This is what I give very high points to seeing this in the book, because I have always thought that most people have their Mage Chronicles in the world of darkness. And even though they don't spend a lot of time talking about the changelings and the werewolves, etc., it's still in that setting. It's kind of in the background. And so my thinking is, look, there are a lot of vampires. and they really concentrate in the cities. So if you're going to go do anything in the cities, vampires is just a part of the picture. Even if you don't emphasize it strongly, it's there. And so here we have the orphans who live in the cities, and they are going to be the ones who are going to interact with vampires more than other mages. So it makes sense to me that they would know more about them, that they would have rotes tailored to dealing with kindred. And you could probably pass yourself as a vampire for months at a time and get into some intricate games with kindred. And this opens up a lot of possibilities for Mage Chronicles. I think this is terribly interesting. And definitely hats off to the person who put this wrote in the book.
Yeah, especially where you can add a Mind 2 component to kind of affect your aura or change your resonance to fit in with a dash of Prime. This is another effect that also pops up when we talk about the Agama Ray or Agama Te sojourn into the underworld, that part of what that effect requires is suppressing your life so that you don't stick out like a sore thumb in the underworld. And I liked it too. They give expansive systems for it where it's like, oh, it takes a point of quintessence for each day that you want to maintain it, so you don't have to worry about having enough successes necessarily. But if you botch during it, you go into a mindscape which you need to finish before you die. And I'm like, well, that's certainly high stakes there. I guess we finished our walkthrough of things. Thoughts on the overall book?
As appropriate for the end of second edition, there's a strong emphasis on the second edition setting, and Mage changed between first and second edition. We talked about it before. I'm not going to go into length, but basically my point here is that in first edition, there was this sense of one mystic society and orphans were on the fringe of it. In second edition, we have a lot of different mystic societies and orphans have their own. And so that's very different. If you want more of a first edition setting, that's something to keep in mind. And this book gives you very much the second edition setting. I'm going to say one of my biggest complaints with this book as a Mage fan is we are in the end of 1998. Mage came out in 1993. We're almost done with 2 editions here. And we've only got one orphan group, and that's the Hollow Ones. Now, there is a sidebar where it says, okay, here's 4 orphan groups that are people of color only, and they are very small. They're not very influential. Each one has one city that it's in. And now let's move on. It's like, no, let's not move on. We need more orphan groups. After 5-6 years of this game, we should have more orphan groups. This is a glaring omission. Granted, that's my opinion. I'm not going to tell other Mage fans what they should think, but I wanted to see more orphan groups mentioned here. I wanted something. Give me a page or a couple of pages here.
There is space between the crafts and orphan groups. That is an area that I too would have liked to have filled out.
Yeah. Also, this book put a lot of emphasis on how newly awakened mages are scared and they're going through a very traumatic time. And yet still they stand strong and defiant and say, I won't join any group. I mean, one of the things that really interested me about the first edition published material was someone goes through an awakening, they're scared, they're shaken up, and someone approaches them and says, hey, look, I know what you're going through, and I can prove it. I can do something to show that it's not hot air. And I'm going to give you a place where you're safe, where we're going to watch out for you, and I'm going to help you direct your abilities so you don't frighten yourself as much. And hey, this is appealing. I can see how an orphan would say, hey, I'm going to take this guy up on this offer, and if he's scary, I'll get out of it later. But here we have these orphans who say, no, get out of my face. I don't trust you. Get away from me. I'm going through hell, and I'm going to keep going through it. And it's like, well, okay, some people are going to have that attitude, but I have a hard time thinking that a lot of people are going to have that attitude in that situation.
The feeling I got is this book takes place in a world where there seem to be a lot of mages, where if you have a nondescript city that has the Chapel Perilous in it and there's a bunch of mages with Arete 4, 5, and 6, either there is an exceptionally strong selection pressure in that it's one of those things where it's up or out. Like if you awaken in the city and you can't handle it, you die quickly. So by definition, the only orphans that you will run into over a period of time are those who have made it through that burnout period, for lack of a better term. They are going to be on average of a higher power level, in the same way that we expect NBA players to be taller and professional football players to be larger. There's a selection force that kind of weeds out most people. And this book will talk about the people who didn't join the traditions, because if they did join the tradition, they're no longer an orphan. So there is that secondary selection pressure. So the book starts from a skewed perspective and then runs with it. So it is one of those things where I ran into the same problem too. Like, oh, this doesn't make sense. And then I'm like, oh, okay, this is from the point of view of the people who actively don't like the traditions and the people who survived on the streets and decided to stay there for some reason. That is not going to be representative of the whole thing, and we walk into it. Partially it would be like complaining, the Celestial Chorus, why don't we hear about the other traditions in the Celestial Chorus book? Well, it's the Celestial Chorus book. So it kind of has that filter applied to it. But yeah, a few more other groups. Orphans in other settings, like maybe outside the city, that's probably vastly less interesting. But again, in that like 1 or 2 paragraph, hey, here's orphans in other settings in America or places where people will likely run it.
Yeah, that was my other complaint. This is the book that claims to be about all orphans in the Mage setting, and we just get the inner city ones, and should have had some material on other groups. But yeah, Terry mentioned the next point I was going to move to, and this book, you kind of get the sense that they're assuming this is a world where there are a lot of mages. I kind of picture a setting where if an orphan awakens in the city and they're trying to figure out what's what, they might come across some information that says, here are the cities where we are gathering. If you want to get with it, come to Chicago, come to Miami, etc., because there's only so many of us and we want to concentrate so that there's strength in numbers, etc. In this book, it just kind of assumes that whatever big city you're in, there's an orphan community there. And so that makes the assumption that there's a lot of mages in the world, because we get this information that a lot of orphans don't make it. Marauderdom, death, burnout, etc. And so only some of them make it. And yet in the prelude, there's this character who's sitting in the Greasy Spoon Diner helping newly awakened mages. And it talks about how there's a steady flow of newly awakened mages coming to her. It's like, okay, if this is happening in most or all of the big cities, there's a lot of mages in this world. So something to keep in mind when you're reading this book.
Yeah, one way I have of interpreting that is that awakening is much more common, but the early period of awakening is very lethal. That if you take like a first edition view, like the opening fiction in 1E is like character awakens, character meets sensei. First adventure character has on their own. They use like 9 vulgar effects just to be able to make it to like a taxi cab. And that presents a very dangerous world for the awakened. So one way of dealing with it is the idea that a lot more people awaken, but a lot more people die in the early stages of having been awakened. But I like your interpretation where it's like, hey, in the United States, here are 5 cities that are known for having exceptionally high orphan populations, and that through whatever method or means, people learn, go to San Francisco, go to Gary, Indiana, go to Boise, go to Atlanta, go to Camden or something like that. And I super like that as an idea, because like in the world of Vampire, there are cities that are generally recognized as being like, oh, this is Sabat, oh, this is Camarilla, oh, this is an independent state. And if you're independent, go to San Francisco or something like that. And I think that would be super cool in Mage. I like the idea that they let you pick, but the downside is, yeah, they're seemingly mages everywhere.
Also, going through the recommended reading list, I was surprised that they did not have Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman, written in 1996, 2 years before this book came out. Neverwhere is novel fiction about, basically you could say, a group of orphans who live underground beneath the city of London. It just seems like a fiction story that would be good inspiration for this book. It seems like they would go together very well. So I'm going to drop a link to that in the show notes if you're looking for books that give you an idea for a gritty, urban, magic-filled orphan kind of setting. Neverwhere's not that bad.
The 2 that struck me as inspirational are, again, I don't read a terrible amount of fiction, so things that were autobiographical. One is Down and Out in Paris and London by George Orwell, which talks about his time being homeless in Paris and being homeless in London. And if you're a George Orwell of 1984 and Animal Farm fame, it's pretty easy to get a hold of and a reasonably good read, if slightly dated. Another more recent one is a book called Travels with Lisbeth by Lars Eigner, and it talks about a person making it being homeless and talks about dumpster diving technique and how to thumb a ride. And it takes place, I guess, in the 70s and 80s. I would have to check date-wise, but it's a couple decades old. But it was pretty fascinating because it is a very systematic view about what it is like to survive as a homeless person, what you do when you only have $2.50, and what goods you can trade for and what goods you can't. So if you're interested in that aspect of things, I too will include my recommendations in the show notes. I guess my big overall thing is this book is well written. Like the words that go next to each other on the page, the authors were on point. I felt like there was a constant voice throughout, even though there were 5 authors. There were a few parts that were a little excessive, but it wouldn't be World of Darkness if there weren't a little bit of satirical excess. Again, the body shoot in the Chapel Perilous. It's World of Darkness. You're going to get that sometimes. I thought the characters were flavorful. I thought the settings were well written. Most of the little introductory fictional pieces make me go, oh, I could see how this would be super terrifying. And even a mage might be uncomfortable dealing with it. Like, it's great if you have sphere magic, but if there's a large person who's in the dominating part of an abusing relationship who's thumping on your walls, like, magic may not be enough to save you. So at the end of the day, mortals still only have 7 health levels, so there's only so much you can do. So my recommendation is, if you've already read Destiny's Price and you've already read Outcasts, A Player's Guide to Pariahs, this book will add something, but not a huge bit. But if you're looking to economize, I think this is a worthy replacement for both of those books and covers a little more space. You don't get rules for cocaine, which I know some people may be looking for, but otherwise this seems to cover almost all the territory that was left by those 2 books.
I can agree with that. I was talking with Terry, and I was saying this book is a rerun, and I'm not happy about that. And Terry said, yes, but there's a lot of people who are coming into Mage now. They're picking up the books. What if they picked up this instead of Outcasts and Destiny's Price? And I thought, Terry, that is a very solid suggestion. Now, Destiny's Price did have a section on the different organized crime groups in big cities, which I thought was interesting.
That was pretty good.
And it had the swarm rules, which it actually refers to in Orphan Survival Guide. It says, look for Destiny's Price swarm rules. But, take those 2 out, and Orphan's Survival Guide could replace those 2 books and do a pretty good job of that. So I can get behind that suggestion.
Destiny's Price also had a few more locations. I generally liked them. Adam thought they were a little bit milquetoast, so take it with a grain of salt if you want, or consult our episodes on those 2 books for further information and learn more at your local library.
Yes, your local Mage the Podcast library of episodes. Yeah. We have covered them, and they are available to you at no charge. Just today, though. This second time that I read through Orphan Survival Guide, just a personal note here. The first time I read it through, there was nothing personal for me. The second time reading through it, I was thinking of interviews that Sotiros Brocato has given, talking about the real life experiences he went through that went behind some of this. And of course, I'm not a personal friend of Sotiros's. I've talked with him a few times, seen him on video chats, and so I don't know him really, really well. But, I've talked to him and spent some time with him, and so I feel like there's some connection at least. And so as I was reading this book the second time, there was these short fiction pieces about people in lousy tenement buildings and apartment buildings going through horrible experiences, and I was reading those, and I couldn't help picturing Sotiros in that situation, and it's like, God, that must have really, really sucked. Now, I know Sotiros does not need my sympathy, but I don't know. It seems like it's there anyway. So that must have been a horrible thing to go through. I'd much rather have a player character run through it than me. But okay, moving on. Our next book takes us to the year 1999.
Dun, dun, dun.
It is Tales of Magic Dark Adventure, and it is the flip side of the coin to Orphan Survival Guide. It is high-octane action movie in your Mage Chronicle. So instead of dropping a big dollop of vampire into your Mage the Ascension Chronicle, this book is going to drop a large dollop of name your favorite action movie.
Yeah, Arnold Schwarzenegger into there, like, what if the tasks used for this weapon were just grenades? And you're like, oh, okay, so...
So I think that brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks, everybody, for listening. If you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com. Our producer gets those emails and filters the ones to us that we need to see and reads all of those very carefully. Let us know your questions, comments, feedback. Subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and your favorite podcast finder. If you like the show, others might like it too. And if you leave a review of Mage the Podcast, it makes us more visible in other people's searches. You can follow us on Twitter at Mage the Podcast. We're also on the web at magethepodcast.com, and it's worth visiting the site because you can see all of our episodes lined up for you. All of the show notes are there, and anything else interesting that we thought you might like to see. This episode is thanks to executive producers Ira Grace, Richard Batt Brewster, John Magnuson, Christopher Phillips, Bryce Perry, Brendan Morrill, Andrew Katz, Michael Parker, Anders, and Justin. If you would like to become an executive producer for Mage the Podcast, it would help us keep producing these episodes, keep bringing them to you at no charge. You would also become part of our own council to discuss upcoming projects. The link in the show notes will get you started. Well, thanks, everyone, for listening, and until next time, truth until paradox, baby.
And my quote for the episode is, years ago, someone rather appropriately nicknamed the men's common toilet Malpheus. Although no one living there now knows the meaning of the term, the name has stuck anyway. And with that, bye.